All right, so where we left off yesterday, we were finishing up talking about the evidence for evolution. Talked about a few different things. Talked about fossils. Talked about comparing the embryos of different species. Understand how things are related. We talked about the fossil record, transitional fossils. Um, and so, one more piece of evidence we have that tells us species have evolved and helps us understand how species are related is molecular evidence. And what that means is looking at DNA, looking at proteins that are found in living things is one way we have of understanding the process of evolution. So every living organism, so DNA is found in every single organism, from a bacteria to a human to a mushroom to a tree. All of them have DNA, and it's basically the same code. Andrew, can you get rid of the AirPod, please? So the genetic code is universal. Every living thing has it. So we can use that. We can compare the DNA code of different species, and it gives us some information. Let me ask you this. If we were to scan all of your DNA and compare it to other people, who would have the most similar DNA to you? Any ideas? Yeah, your sibling. If you have a sibling, you both share the most DNA in common. Okay. What if we say, well, outside of your direct sibling, who else would share the most DNA with you? Well, not quite your parent. How much of one parent's DNA do you actually have? How much? 50%. Half your genes come from each parent. Who else would have similar DNA? Which cousin? Who would have the most similar DNA to you?
First cousin.
Yeah, your first cousins. Who after that? Second cousins, and so forth. Who's the common ancestor of you and your sibling? Your parents. Who's the common ancestor of you and your first cousin? Your grandparents. How about you and your second cousin? Great grandparents. And so we could think about those same kind of things related to species. When we compare two species, the more similar their DNA, the more recently they had a common ancestor. So we can compare DNA, we can compare proteins and so forth. This is a graph that shows a comparison of proteins between humans and a bunch of other species. This is comparing a special type of molecule called cytochrome C. So when you look at that, which species is most closely related to humans? Yeah, the chimps. The sequence of amino acids in this protein between humans and chimps are exactly the same. So we have the same protein basically that chimps do. If you compare the same protein that's found in mice, it's about 91% similar. And so by comparing this information, we could see sort of how species are related. And this should make sense, right? Corn, maize is corn. This is quite a bit different. The same protein that's found in corn is very different than what's found in humans. That makes sense. Corn is a plant. Humans are animals. We share the most in common with those mammals that are listed on that chart. This is just another view of that same thing. It's showing humans compared to other species. So obviously, humans compared to humans, we have zero differences. But then as we look at these other species, we can see how many differences there are. And so scientists use DNA to help us understand these relationships. So now we're going to move on. So we know through fossils, through looking at embryos, looking at structures organisms have, that's the information that tells us species have evolved over time. That species change. That species can be related to each other through their evolutionary history. Well, we talked when we learned about Darwin. Darwin came up with, and Wallace, the idea about how that happens. Like, how can species change? How did horses go from little dog-like creatures to big hoofed animals they are today? And natural selection is the name for that. Natural selection is the process by which species can change. And it's really, it almost seems like common sense when we talk about it. It's not really that complicated. This idea that Darwin and Wallace came up with. And so it requires a few things. So first off, overpopulation. How many eggs does a fish lay when it spawns? Anyone have any idea? A lot. That's really my point. It could be hundreds of thousands. Like a single fish, when it spawns, can release hundreds of thousands of eggs at once. And then they can be fertilized. Do they all grow into adult fish? No. Only a tiny percent do. What happens to the rest? They die, they get eaten, they wash away, they don't have enough nutrients. All sorts of different things can happen. They all can't possibly survive. Okay? And that's true of all species. Can all the white-tailed deer living in our area, can they all survive? No. Some of them are going to die from predators, or from car accidents, or because they might not have enough food, or because it's going to be too cold at certain times in the winter. But then the question is, okay, well, if they're not all going to survive, which ones will? Is it random, or is there something else? Which individuals survive in a big population if some are going to die?
The strongest.
Close, Brian, but I don't want to use the word strongest. Because is a deer, what does it mean to be strong as a deer? But you're very close.
Be the most adapted with the environment.
Yeah, the ones that are best adapted. The ones that just happen to be born with the most helpful characteristics and traits. It might be the strongest, but it might be just have slightly thicker fur, right? Because that helps insulate them a little bit better. Or maybe they're a little bit taller and they can reach a little bit more food than other members of the deer population. And those are the ones that happen to be born with these helpful characteristics, helpful variations that survive. And if they can survive, that means they can also do what that's important for a species? Reproduce. And when they reproduce, their offspring have those same similar characteristics, right? They might happen to have a little bit thicker fur that helps their offspring survive a little bit better. And this process, repeated many generations, can lead to the species actually changing as a whole. What happens to the deer that were born with thin fur? They may not survive as well. And so if we continue, 20 generations in the future, are there going to be any of those thin-furred deer left? No, because if they're not surviving, they're not going to reproduce. That characteristic is not going to be passed on. Okay, so that's what this kind of summarizes. So there's competition for survival, okay, in all species. But because the individuals vary, they're different from each other in several ways. Some individuals are better able to survive than others. And those that are best, the word we use is the fittest. Survival of the fittest is maybe a phrase that you've heard in relation to evolution. The best adapted ones are the ones that survive. So we call the factor that determines which ones survive and which don't is called the selecting agent. Like for the deer, maybe it's food. Right? The selecting agent could be a limited amount of food, and that's why they're not all going to survive. Or it might be the temperature. during the winter could be the selecting agent. In some species, it might be a predator as the selecting agent because they're under pressure from predators. Could be many different things. But over many generations, helpful variations become more common in the species. Okay? And any variation that's less helpful will become less common because those individuals won't survive as well and won't reproduce as much. So if we look at a diagram here, just we'll talk about some examples. This gives us kind of the overview. So we have here species of, I don't know what these are, elk or something. Are we getting towards that time? We have this species of elk, okay? There's too many. They can't all survive. Let's say there's not enough. It's too cold for them or something, okay? And all of these aren't going to survive into maturity. But they're different from each other. They have variations. They have different colors, different sizes, different antlers, okay? When there is selection, and some of them are going to survive and some are not, the ones that happen to have the most helpful and most beneficial characteristics are going to be the ones that survive. And when they do and reproduce, they're going to pass on those traits to the next generation. So in this diagram, it appeared that having this, whatever these darker fur colored ones, though that was somehow an advantage. More of them survived than the light colored ones. And in the next generation, therefore, there's going to be more dark colored ones. And then if that happens, the same situation again, in the next generation, there's going to be more. In the next generation, there's going to be more. And over time, the whole population might change. Let's talk about a couple of other examples. Giraffes. You don't have this slide? We're just going to talk about some. If you imagine giraffes have long necks. You know that if you've seen one at the zoo or something. That wasn't always the case. Giraffes didn't always have long necks. And the ancestor to giraffes had shorter necks. So how we could try to think about natural selection. How would natural selection result in giraffes that had longer necks like they are today? So first, you start with variation. If we were to measure all of our neck length, do you think it would vary between us? Yeah, I'm sure it would. Right? Some people might have longer necks than other people. And there's just natural variation in our population. Well, the same was probably true of giraffes. There's probably some variation in their necks. Well, if food that giraffes eat, which is typically up in trees, is limited, which variations are going to be able to get more food? One's just slightly longer. Even it might just be a little bit. It doesn't mean like they have to have like necks that are 8 feet long. Even if it's a little bit longer, they're going to be able to reach a little bit higher into trees to get a little bit more food. And if they have more food, what does that mean about their survival? Probably they're going to live. If they live, they can reproduce. What are their little baby giraffes probably going to have? Not like long necks, but even just slightly longer. And that's going to be an advantage for them. And probably they're going to survive better. Repeat thousands of generations, and eventually all the giraffes in the whole population have longer necks. And we would say the giraffes have evolved. They evolved to have a long neck over time because that variation was helpful. Well, why isn't it even longer? Why isn't their neck 30 feet long if it helps them get more food? Anyone think of a reason why it just doesn't continue getting longer and longer? Right?
It would be like obvious in the wild.
Yeah, it might, if it gets too long, it might actually be a disadvantage. Maybe they stand out to predators. The real challenge that comes with having that long neck is pumping blood up to their brain. Dress have to have a really huge, very strong heart, specialized blood vessels, because it's hard for their heart to pump blood all the way up to their brain due to gravity. And so there's like a limit to how long it can be through biology. Here's another example. Peppered moss. Wait, do I have a diagram here? Oh yeah, there's the drafts again. We could see sort of the changes in drafts over time. Peppered moss are an interesting example. Did you guys learn about them in 7th grade? Yeah? Do you remember the story, Ryan?
I think so.
What happened with these
It
moss?
was like some of them were near like a factory or something, and the smoke would like make all the trees black, so they would stand out with their white color, so they evolved to be the same colors as trees.
Right. Was it smoke getting on the moss that made them dark? Right, because some people make that mistake. You're right. So the peppered moss is a famous example. The first time this was recorded was like in England. It was around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And there were these moss that are found throughout England. They were called peppered moss because they had like variety. They were like light and some dark, and they had speckles on them like these moss that you see here. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the bark of trees was kind of light in color, like this, because there's lichen and stuff on there. And the majority of the moss were the lighter variation, like this one that you see here. There were some dark ones once in a while due to natural variation, but not as many. But after the Industrial Revolution, soot and pollution from the burning of coal in factories caused the bark of trees to become darker. And when scientists recorded the number of the different types of moss, what they found is the population changed. And like Ryan was explaining, dark moss started to become more and more common over time. Why did they become more common? What was the advantage of being a darker colored moth in this situation? Yeah.
More difficult to see.
Yeah. These are great food sources for birds. And so predators could find the moss that had this other color on the dark wood. The light moss were easy to find, and they were eaten more frequently, and therefore they didn't reproduce as much. And over time, the population shifted from mostly light colored moss to mostly dark colored moths. I didn't even touch it. So peppered moss are another example. We'll talk about one more. If you've ever had a bacterial infection, like a common one you may have had is strep throat or an ear infection, right? Your ear hurts. When you go to what causes an ear infection or strep throat? Anybody know? Caused by bacteria, right? So certain bacteria cause strep throat. So when these bacteria, if you get them from somewhere in the environment, from somebody else, a population of these strep bacteria start growing in your throat. Their population grows. They damage the tissue in your throat. It starts to hurt, gets inflamed, and you have a sore throat. Maybe you go to the doctor. The doctor gives you a strep test. They put that big Q-tip thing down your throat. Everyone hates that. And they culture it to be sure it's actually strep throat. And then what is the treatment for that? Yeah, what is that? What is the pill?
It's pretty big though.
Yeah, or sometimes it's that gross, like pink bubblegum flavored amoxicillin. What kind of drugs are those? They're antibiotics. An antibiotic is a special drug that kills bacteria. So that's why you're getting it, because it's going to kill the strep bacteria in your throat. If you are familiar, you go to the doctor. What do they tell you? Let's say they give you, 10-day supply of those huge pills. Do you stop taking them after you feel better? What do they tell you have to do? Keep taking the entire prescription. And the reason has to do with natural selection. Because let's imagine the scenario. You have your throat hurts. You go get a strep test. They say, yes, you have strep throat. They give you your antibiotics. You take them for 2 or 3 days. And you start to feel better. So you have millions of bacteria growing in your throat if you have a strep infection. Which ones die off first when you're taking your antibiotic? Yeah, the ones that are kind of weaker. The ones that have no resistance to the antibiotic at all. So you kill off the weakest ones first, and then even as you take it for a few days, maybe almost all of them have been killed off. But which ones are still hanging on? Yeah, the ones that maybe are resistant, more resistant to the antibiotic. And even though maybe there's not that many of them. So your throat actually feels better. So you say, oh, I don't want to take these giant pills. And you stop taking it. What happens then? Or what can happen?
It becomes worse.
Why? What happens with those resistant ones that we're holding on? They start reproducing. And the population starts growing and it comes back. And now your throat starts to hurt again. So you say, oh, I better take these pills now. But those ones that reproduce, maybe they're resistant to it. Maybe they're stronger and it's not affecting them. And now you go back to the doctor, you say, oh, my throat hurts again. And that antibiotic is probably not going to work. And this is sort of showing this in a diagram. The darker colored one, so this is the original population. Okay. They vary. The variation is the level of resistance to antibiotics. So the ones that have lower resistance are killed off first, but you might still be left with some that happen to have that resistance. And if you don't kill all of them, they can start to grow again, causing a resistant infection. There's some varieties of bacteria that are resistant to almost every antibiotic that we have. Those are really dangerous infections to get. And that's because they've evolved. We use antibiotics so much, we sort of have selected for the most resistant bacteria. You know, if you usually have an infection, a bacterial infection, and it's not responding to antibiotics, you can go back to the doctor and they give you a different type of a different class. Hopefully that works. But if the infection you have is resistant, it might not. And yeah, does natural selection work on humans? Of course. Is natural selection working on us now? In some ways. But have humans short-circuited natural selection a little bit? If I were born 20,000 years ago, I would probably not be alive today. I have horrible vision. I wear contacts. I have thick glasses if I don't wear contacts. Probably 20,000 years ago as a hunter-gatherer, I would not be very successful. I probably would have died before I had children, and therefore my bad eyesight genes likely would not have been passed on to my children. Humans, because of technology, because of culture, humans can sort of take care of each other, and because of some medical techniques and technology, you know, people survive today that would never have back in times when we had to hunt for our food and so forth.